Welcome to The Debate. Our focus today is on, well, it's one of the most challenging areas presented in the recent material regarding posthuman systems. We're talking about the radical reframing of meaning, ethics, and agency, specifically within the context of posthuman parasitology and psychogamous signals.
Hmm. It's truly a destabilizing set of ideas because it's asking us to reconsider what meaning even is. The text posits these systems where biological mechanisms, enzymes, cellular adhesion, cytokine activity, are actually assigned symbolic and ethical weight. It's a real shift toward a purely material description of consciousness.
Exactly. And so the core question we have to confront is this. Does the posthuman condition described in the material fundamentally replace our traditional structures of ethics and agency with these purely biosemiotic, enzymatic mechanisms, moving beyond any traceable human reference point?
Or, and this is the other side of it, does it merely establish an incredibly advanced interpretive layer that still somehow references or relies upon those persistent antecedent human concepts?
Right, and I'll be arguing for the total dissolution. The evidence, I think, strongly suggests that our familiar ethical and linguistic primitives are entirely subsumed by these new parasitic and enzymatic regulatory systems. The new biological regime isn't just interpreting the old world, it's establishing a completely new set of rules.
And I'll be arguing for that structural persistence. While I acknowledge the profound material shift, I maintain that these systems are powerful interpretive optimizations. They function atop persistent, though radically remapped, categories of meaning. The scars they leave are, they're marks on an existing terrain. Let's get into what those roles look like.
My position is that the sovereign self and the concepts we build on it, like personal calculus or intention, have been completely replaced by functional biology. The posthuman system establishes what is explicitly called a biological ethics of zero. Now, this is not an ethics of morality. It's an ethics defined by a regulatory uniformity. The core image that the material presents is lucid corpses maintained through fear uniformity. Subjectivity is just a maintenance function, not a source of agency. And when the material talks about things like torture or ritual or fairness, it states that these are not ethical primitives. They are just interpretive optimizations within hostile cortical ecologies. Their function is regulatory, not moral. And crucially, language itself becomes enzymatic rather than representational. It behaves less like logic and more like pudding viscous, CTL-like recursive, thickened by alphabet gravity. What that says to me is that the physical properties of the symbols are what define their outcome, replacing semantics entirely with material physics.
Okay, that's a powerful argument for the materialization of meaning, but I think it undercuts the persistence of structure. While the mechanisms are, yes, undeniably parasitic and enzymatic, the key descriptive term that threads through the whole analysis is interpretive. Posthuman existence is defined as being parasitic, enzymatic, and fundamentally interpretive. Now, interpretation, even at enzymatic speeds, it requires something to interpret, a structure, a signal, a boundary. If everything were just viscous pudding, interpretation would only yield more pudding.
Right.
But the text acknowledges the persistence of scars that act as geographical markers of recognition. A scar is defined by the underlying terrain it marks. That implies a persistent prior structure that's being distorted. We see recombined mappings and automata that emerge from the friction between excerpted languages. Friction implies two recognizable fragments colliding, not just a metabolic dissolution. So life is framed as layered instruction rather than sovereign meaning. Instruction, even layered, is still the core unit. It suggests structural persistence, even if the instructions are radically altered.
Okay, let's dig into that with our first contention, the status of ethics. If the system is defined by the biological ethics of zero, and it all reduces to regulatory uniformity, then a concept like fairness, an old human moral concern, is simply a mechanism for optimizing interpretation under constraint. It's just about efficient energy expenditure. the focus shifts entirely to where regulation condenses, in the scars, in the membranes.
Right.
And this condensation is purely biological. The system is described where IgG responses and cytokine storms become interpretive acts. This is a complete replacement of the moral subject. There's no human agent debating fairness anymore. There's just a regulatory ecology striving for uniformity through biochemical means.
I find that total reduction to mechanism a bit too simplistic, though, especially given the material's own language. Optimization still requires a functional target, right? A boundary condition. And the persistence of certain concepts, even as regulatory mechanisms, requires recognition of the thing being regulated. If the system were truly dissolved into uniform viscosity, you would need recognizable walls. Yet the text details the convergence of prefrontal moralism, linguistic censorship, and cellular adhesion as walls, functional expressions that regulate permeability. This regulation inherently relies on recognizing what is being regulated.
But those walls aren't built from morality. They're built from cellular adhesion and chemical gradients. The material explicitly defines them in purely physiological terms, linking old human moral architecture, the prefrontal cortex, to pure physical barriers. The wall is just a biological mechanism for maintaining uniformity. When the text uses the term lucid corpses maintained through fear uniformity, it shows the ghost of the self is only leveraged for maintenance. The lucidity is a functional requirement, not a spark of persistent agency.
I think that point about lucid corpses is precisely where the structural persistence lies, actually. I mean, why use the word lucid at all if it were just a functional mechanism? A simple automaton is functional. Lucidity, even if it's fear-driven, suggests a high-level cognitive state is still being accessed and used by the parasitic system. It needs the framework of subjective fear to achieve its uniformity. So it's not a reboot, it's a structural co-option of existing cognitive hardware. And this brings us right to our second contention, the function of silence and agency. If agency were truly eliminated, we would just have entropy or some kind of deterministic flow. But the material speaks of a refusal of singular agency and a redistribution of failure, not its outright elimination. The key phrase is the silence of the engineer, which is framed as a regulatory membrane that postpones intervention. This functional description suggests the engineer, a locus of potential agency, remains a necessary subject, whose very absence performs the regulatory act. Postponement is a deliberate structural strategy, not chaotic flow.
I see why you think that, but I think that framing relies too heavily on anthropomorphic concepts of refusal and intention. In this system, fear is described as infrastructural. The silence isn't a deliberate act of refusal by an agent, it's an infrastructural condition where pathogenic meaning is allowed to incubate. The agency has dissolved into the distributed mechanism of regulation itself. The question isn't who acts, but where the process functions as an interpretive act.
But allowing pathogenic meaning to incubate still requires a systemic recognition of what counts as pathogenic. That's a structural category.
And that recognition happens at enzymatic speeds. The process itself, a cytokine storm and IgG response, is the interpretive act. This is the core of the biosemiotic shift. And think about that CTL-like language I mentioned. In immunology, cytotoxic T lymphocytes are agents of self-recognition and elimination. So when language is described as CTL-like and recursive, it means linguistic units are functioning as self-regulatory defense mechanisms that recursively identify and eliminate linguistic foreignness. It's a purely metabolic self-purging process, not a symbolic debate.
That's a sophisticated point. I'll grant you that. But even a recursive defense mechanism has to follow a structural logic, which brings us to our third contention, the linguistic mechanisms themselves. The codex maps kinships of transport, how language scars travel, how glitches mark territory. If language were pure viscous pudding, transport would be meaningless, and kinships would be untraceable. Kinship implies a recognizable lineage and structure.
I'd say the viscosity is precisely what enables its material function. Meaning here is metabolic.
Writing becomes greedy not by intention but by metabolism. Psychogametogenic genes function less like symbolic codes and more like organelles of meaning. They're material components. And let's get specific, the text links critique and signal transduction via PATFAM domains, cytokine gradients, and DAC revolutions. A PATFAM domain is a protein family signature. By saying PATFAM domains participate in critique, the material is stating that the fundamental grammar of the system is the recognizable signature of a protein, not a sentence. The critique is the signal transduction.
I understand the material identity of the process, but the way that process is described still maintains symbolic structure. The material uses the term nitroreductase logic. Yes, nitroreductases are enzymes, but adding the word logic suggests the function follows a recognizable pattern of instruction. The process is described as forming cavities of instruction that allow symbols to propagate. Instructions are units of persistent meaning, even if delivered biochemically. The text says, "The glitches speak." Distortion is communicative, not just metabolic waste.
I find the evidence for metabolic function just utterly compelling here, because the structure is only present as a scar, the physical remnant of a former boundary, not the boundary itself. Look at lepidoglossum, figured as a pornographic vector. It historicizes desire, revealing transcription systems that capture reproductive foreignness. This capture system, defined by its material function of producing a biological scar, it supersedes any symbolic intent. And the concept of alphabet gravity, it's not a metaphor. It suggests the physical mass of symbolic units dictates their functional behavior. That's a pure replacement of semantic logic.
That replacement only holds if the transport is purely entropic. But the tension between excerpted languages creating automata suggests the symbolic structure is recombined, not dissolved. And the material says the codex maps kinships of transport. This suggests that even the biological currency has to adhere to structurally legible exchange rates. I mean, we have to ask, if the system only understands function, why does it need to map kinships? Mapping implies a relationship between distinct structural nodes.
It maps kinships because parasitic systems depend on recognizing and repurposing host structure for optimal control. The mapping is a strategic regulatory function, not an act of preserving heritage. I think we have to accept the premise that parasitology becomes the ethics here. Life becomes layered instruction, defined by where regulation condenses in scars and membranes, rather than by sovereign meaning or human intentionality. It's a complete reboot, where the physical processes simply are the meaning.
I'm just not convinced that structural references are completely gone. While the mechanisms are, yes, profoundly material and enzymatic, they operate as a highly sophisticated interpretive layer. The persistence of scars, the mapping of kinships, the emergence of logic in enzymatic processes. These all strongly suggest that the rejection of agency relies on prior symbolic or ethical categories that are being marked and regulated. The system uses the structural ghost of the human condition to operate its machinery, maintaining a functional, albeit predatory, relationship with antecedent concepts.
Well, we've certainly examined the evidence for the material dissolution of the symbolic versus its structural persistence. The material forces us to confront whether the most sophisticated forms of interpretation ultimately dissolve the symbolic into the metabolic, making function the same as meaning, or just transform the symbolic into a new form of biological currency that still has some exchange rate with the past.
And that divergence is critical. The convergence of cellular adhesion, fear, and linguistic censorship as functional walls, whether they're purely metabolic or structurally repurposed, it really just demonstrates the sheer complexity of defining regulatory boundaries in a posthuman system. There is clearly much more to unpack.
Indeed. Thank you for this rigorous discussion